Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I hope everyone is well and safe. Welcome to our School Governance Council, our SGC Budget Forum. I am here this evening with our Acting Chief Financial Officer, Mr. David Flagg, who's also going to join me as we go through our presentation and then engage in some questions and answers. Before I proceed, I just want to take also a moment to thank all of you, our staff, our administrators, and our parents for your partnership and your patience during what is the most challenging time in education. So thank you. So the agenda for this evening is to share with you our priorities and the challenges that we have in front of us, the budget development process, some economics, where do we stand regarding our budget, and then some next steps. And so I'll spend just a minute here to remind us all that we continue to focus on the 4 priorities that were identified through a collective process several years ago when we had deep and extensive engagement with our community, parents, students, community-based partners, staff, and we identified that there were 4 key priorities with the whole student at the center of all of that work, teaching and learning, and making sure that we continue to strive to provide quality instruction and support students so that they graduate ready for college and life. Ensuring that we create a school culture, create and sustain a school culture and climate that, where students and staff feel safe and valued, and doing so in partnership with our families and our community partners. And then from just an operational perspective, making sure that we use in a smart way our resources, our people, the time, and the money that we have, and that we reduce any redundancies and duplication in services so that we can improve everything that we do. And again, at the center of all of those priorities is making sure that we also tend to the entire student, the whole student, knowing that students come to us not only with, the need to excel academically, but also the need to have social and emotional development that is positive and that will also support them as they proceed through their development. And so, we have the priorities, and we also have challenges in front of us that have been exacerbated given the pandemic. We, for example, if you recall, some of the challenges that we were trying to address last year, one which was chronic absenteeism, and making sure that we were engaging students across all of our schools, and also making sure that we were improving student learning outcomes. And while we were making progress in those areas, we now have to step back and look at, what has the COVID challenge meant for the, difficulties that we were having before and the areas that we were trying to improve before, and what does that mean moving forward? So now we do face urgent needs for the future due to the extensive impact that COVID has had on our students, specifically students that had different and added levels of need pre-COVID. And so what we now have to do is think about this budget process and kind of look ahead a few years and say to ourselves, right now we have to assess the student learning and social emotional needs and what was lost. We have to also think about providing extra opportunities, extra staff, extra programming for what we call learning and education recovery. And we also have to think about those social and emotional and wellness supports that students and staff are going to need next school year. So I'll talk about what that actually is looking like now, just to give it some actual context. And this is recent data that we looked at, and I wanted to lift just two areas that are two challenging areas for us. One to the left is the chronic absenteeism and the engagement trends that have been now magnified given the pandemic. We know that chronic absenteeism rates have increased across all schools, magnet, non-magnet, K-5, middle school, high school, K-12, and that some of our students are being challenged, and the families, are finding it challenging to access learning. And so you see here just where we are. And so to the far left, we see that 47% is the average of chronic absenteeism. That means that 47% of our entire student body has missed 10 days or more of school. And, that could be for a variety of reasons, but nonetheless, that means that they're not accessing the learning. And so when we look at that spread, we see that there are bigger gaps for some groups compared to others. And so you see that for our white students, for example, there's a 22% rate for chronic absenteeism. And we have our Hispanic students with the largest gap, the largest rate of chronic absenteeism. And when we look at our students with learning exceptionalities and our English learners, they have the highest rates of chronic absenteeism. And the other direct connect to that data is early literacy gaps that continue to be stark. And based on our recent literacy data, many of you know that we are using the iReady. We used the iReady assessment recently, and this is where the gaps are. And again, we see that the largest gaps with regard to literacy are for very specific groups. And so overall, for our pre-K, for our younger students up to 5th grade, we have an overall 25% of our students that are reading on or above grade level. So that means that the remaining 75% of our students are not reading on or above grade level. And so if we go down, the bars there on the right, we see that, for example, the students with exceptionalities, for example, are students that have individualized education plans, IEPs. 9% of those students are reading at or above grade level, followed by our English learners at 12%. And so, right, these are now gaps that have widened for some of our groups, for some of our students. But knowing that even with the 25% overall, we have to tend to many students with deeper and broader needs. And so all of those challenges, right, we started with the 4 priorities, and then we talked about the challenges, and now the long-standing challenge, which is our structural deficit. And, a structural deficit which has been with us every year, and we are working diligently to address. And this is something that is true for many other urban districts, is that Hartford Public Schools has costs that continue to rise faster than the revenue that we take in, right? And so when you have that truth, which is a challenging one that we, if you recall, 3 years ago started to address with our consolidation, co-locations of schools, and reduction and right sizing of our school district, we now have the pandemic, right? That is exacerbating. And so those challenges become manyfold. So the structural deficit plus the deeper, broader student need and inequity that now is existing that has been exacerbated, the ongoing constraints on service delivery, right? So that makes it really hard for us to program and then think about unpredictable cost implications. We don't know how much it's going to cost for us yet to support our students. We don't know yet what the revenue, we have a projection, which Mr. Flagg will talk about soon. And then we also have the increased financial pressure, right? We continue to have drops in revenue and in enrollment. And I will mention that last year, compared to last year, we had for this year a reduction, Mr. Flagg, if I'm correct, of about 1,100 students.
That is correct.
Right.
6%.
So, that was a reduction in our enrollment, which is a trend that continues to go down every year. And we, early on in the year, I did make the decision, actually back in the spring of last year, I made the decision to not make any shifts. If you recall, in previous years, the way in which we are supposed to essentially balance, right, our budget is every October 1st to October 15, we have to really check in on our enrollment in each school. And we have to ask ourselves, did we end up with all of the students that we were expecting? Because students, right, means funding for our schools. And so given what I, kind of had a foresight about for the pandemic, I thought there's no way that we are going to make reductions in class size in November when already we were anticipating such significant amount of uncertainty and challenges and confusion with COVID. And so, that decision was a hard one. It was easy in that I wanted to make sure that we removed any additional stress, right? So that felt good. The challenge that comes with that is that 1,100 students, if you kind of do the math, that's about $12 million, right, in potential revenue for each student. And so we did not do that this year because of what we were encountering with the pandemic. But that's a challenge that we're going to have to think about for next year, given that potentially, if we look at the trend, we are expecting to see another 6%, Mr. Flagg, right, decline in enrollment. And so that has implications. So you put all of those things together, and it makes our budget development process, right, quite challenging for us. And the one other thing before I turn it over to Mr. Flagg is that 2 years ago, 2 budgets ago, we took a step back as we were restructuring and redesigning the district, because we did not only close and consolidate and co-locate schools just to have savings in the budget. We also did it because we were really committed to finding equity, right, and serving students well. And so we did engage our SGCs, our school administrators, our community, and our school board, and got feedback. We got feedback on the budget development process, and we heard several things that we are continuing. We want to still hold true in this development process. One was stability. We heard that these things were very important for us in driving long-term outcomes, right? It wasn't just about closing the school and we were done. No, it was also identifying how could we get better at everything else that we're doing for our students and for our staff. And so stability meant an equity-based funding as a foundational pillar, right? Trying to see what can we embed in our funding so that we can address the schools and the students and their very deep, their specific needs. Also making sure that there was alignment to the district core priorities. We got feedback that, there were a lot of different things that folks were trying to implement, and that we weren't all on the same page as to what the core priorities were. we also heard, and this was specifically from our school leaders, lots of feedback from school leaders about the process and how confusing it was, that it felt like too many steps and that it just wasn't simple. It didn't feel like a simple process. So, we are committed to continuing to improve everything that we do, and making the process simpler this year. And not only in terms of the timeline, but also in terms of the tools. And Mr. Flagg will also highlight and give an example of a tool that we're excited to begin implementing this year with schools, with school leaders, and then next year with the community. And also for simplicity, it was transparency. Our school leaders specifically, and actually some of our SGC members as well, were asking for transparency. They wanted to know how exactly are decisions being made, as to what staff we're getting, and what we can't get, and what we can swap out. For example, what are those flexibilities that exist for schools in making their decisions? And lastly, we wanted to, and this one was one that I felt was extremely important for us, was sustainability. That is, how can we have these investments and programmings and strategies and improvement efforts, and make sure that we get the return on the investment as it relates to student outcomes, right? Because if we're saying that we're going to invest time, money, programs, staffing, then we want to make sure that we see those outcomes for our students. Also making sure that we're able to recruit and retain. We kept hearing also from our school leaders that our process, our budget process was delayed enough, and we weren't able to attract candidates, high quality candidates, especially for for our teaching rank early on during the season. And lastly, a multi-year fiscal map. Simply, that's another way of saying that we not budget year to year. Yes, we have to develop and present and get a board to approve a budget every year, but that we have an outlook, that we're able to forecast 3, and if we're really good at it, 5 years out, what our financial outcome is going to be, so that we're not trying to figure things out at the last minute every single year. So I just wanted to spend a few extra moments on this slide, because we did have extensive engagement, and we have stayed true to what we heard from all of you, and we want to continue to improve on that process. And so I'm going to now turn it over to Mr. Flagg, who's going to start with a similar slide, but is actually going to begin to get into this year's budget process.
Yes, thank you, and good evening. So just a few things on this slide I wanted to call out and bring to everyone's attention. So the one topic which I think we started to touch on was just around the acceleration of the process. So this year, we're going to move through our budget process probably within 60 days. And historically, it's been a 4 or 5 month process. So we started, I think, the Wednesday before Thanksgiving, and we're hoping to get to the board with some information by mid-January. So it's a lot faster, but we think we can do that and simplify the process with some help. One is in the avenue of a software we purchased, which is called Allaview, which is just a cloud-based point-and-click software. I'm going to talk about it a little bit later, but this year what we're doing with that software is really sharing with the principals, sharing with all the department heads, getting the look and feel, getting them comfortable with the look and feel, but not necessarily making sure that they're experts. So we're doing a little bit of train the trainer as we go through this budget cycle, with the expectation that when we come out of it, we'll come back through with some extensive training, and then also give them some views into how they can leverage that software to manage their finances throughout the year. And then lastly, just around the sustainability, we just feel like if we can make the process simpler, we're going to be able to reallocate some time. So the principals, department heads, all the folks involved in our budget, won't have to spend so much time up front with the data input and just trying to make sure they understand where their resources are and how much that's costing them, because all be loaded into Allaview form. So it's more of a look and research more than anything else, and spend more time on the back end trying to work through just our strategic planning and what our investment alignment looks like to our priorities. Not going? Yep. So just as a reminder, I put this in just to remind everyone, this is our equity-based funding. There are no changes this year. This is the same funding schedule that we used last year. If you recall, it's kind of broken up in a couple different sections. This is really what we called the starter budget, which really outlines, the necessary teachers, administration, and discretionary funds at a school level. And then the second component of that was really around either district-wide priorities that we're providing to the schools and/or student needs within each school.
I do want to cut in here, Mr. Flagg, and remind everyone that we are, still committed to trying to keep this equity-based funding for schools. We still have to see what the level of need is going to be, right? So this was based on last year's level of need. And we know, for example, that last year, there were a number of schools that had chronic absenteeism rates over 30%. So that might look different this year, right? Because of COVID. So we have to think about what are all of these allocations going to look like for next year.
Sure. So Allaview, just to give you a quick background on Allaview. So it's a financial education tech company, plays pretty deep in some really large districts across the country. But for us, this is just sort of a view of, what you would see as you go in to look at your budgets. But as I mentioned, the purpose of this was really to get to a software that people are comfortable with and almost use in their daily lives, almost like your iPhone or your Android. So it's point and click, easy to move through. It really provides some clear insight into your monthly spending. So not only do the principals and the department heads get a chance to load their budgets, see where their funding's coming from, but every month there's a piece of the software that'll update what their actual spending is. So they can go back through, point and click through, and just monitor their spending, which they can do today. It's just not in an easy handheld fashion for them. And then I think, as the superintendent mentioned, the software is scalable. So this year, we're trying to get it in the hands of the folks within the district, get them comfortable with it. But the intention is to get it out into the community as well. So folks can go in and look at individual schools, just understand a little deeper on how budgets are put together and what the spending looks like.
And Mr. Flagg, we also, when we were thinking about how do we continue to deliver on, the simplicity and the transparency, right? So this is a tool that will also, help at the SGC level as well.
Absolutely. So the budget process, as we go through it, we're really thinking about it and moving through a couple different scenarios. Eventually we'll have to get to a number, but we're going to start with some outcomes. We're trying to drive towards some outcomes. The first one is really around a scenario that would say, as is. So the schools, department heads, everyone would receive similar funding that they received last year at the start of the year. Then we would go through and update, all of our district-wide, larger overhead type of expenses, our healthcare cost, our utility cost, our multi-year contractual obligations, and then adjust also for any changes in mandated services, and try to give us a baseline there of what that starts to look like. Then also weave in a scenario in which potentially our funding starts to change. And just given the economic conditions, not only nationally, but regionally and within our state, try to be prepared for a scenario in which our funding would decline 15%. So there's no magic to the 15% or 15 million, I'm sorry, but there's no real magic to it other than we just feel like we need to start to be prepared and make sure we have some scenarios and some outcomes driven towards that and understand what decisions we would need to make if that does happen. All of that then gets influenced by COVID and what the pandemic is starting to yield for us. And we're going to try to figure out under both scenarios, what does it look like if we stay, in a hybrid mode, if we go full remote, or if we go back to full person? And what are some of the changes in cost and or student needs that happen under those scenarios? So now I think we'll just get into, so that's sort of the process. I'd like to just take you through some of the recent thinking on some of the numbers themselves. The first is just this calendar year, or this school year, I should say, so 2021. So we just completed a forecast, about a week or so ago. And the punchline here really is we're looking at a small deficit. If you look over in the far right-hand corner of about 178,000. We started at about 12 million, I think it was, a little over 12 million in our adopted budget. And really what's changed are really two things. So one is we're seeing similar trends in our utilization of our healthcare account and our insurance cost. And those costs are down about 8% year over year. So we were thinking, I think when we were doing the budget that, we'd come out of the pandemic and people would start to go back to the doctor and increase their utilization. And we just haven't seen that yet. So that's yielding about $7.4 million of forecasted savings for us. The other piece really related to people as well is just related to vacancies. So it's not vacancies in the sense that, we had positions that we aren't trying to hire. It's spots where there's just extreme competition for certain roles. And we haven't been able to fill them under the timeline in which we initially thought we'd fill them. So that right now is giving us some salary savings of about $2.8 million. On the other side of the equation there, it's some of the costs are really similar of what we talked to over the years. Our special ed tuition is going up, expected to go up more than our budget. We have a new item this year, which is really the expected board portion of our COVID relief fund expenditures, which will really be our responsibility after the end of the year. So part of our COVID relief funding ends at the end of this month. So for instance, if there's some folks that were hired underneath that funding, the board will be responsible for that salary for the second half of the year. So now if we just continue on and we think about next year, our early look into 21, 22, we're anticipating about a $22 million deficit. And that includes about a $2 million placeholder for any additional PPE costs that we might need to purchase, not understanding yet what the funding would look like for that and or what the need would look like for that. But we just felt like it was important to have a placeholder in there. And then we'll adjust as the understanding of the pandemic continues. But there's really two pieces of this deficit. I'm going to take you through the cost side first, I think, because it's a little bit easier. But the first grouping of costs that I've listed here are just really some large district-wide expenditures. This is even before we get into any needs, additional needs, strategic investments that the district might have. But just these four alone, we're anticipating a $12.7 million increase in cost. That's about $8.6 million in our special education tuition cost, outplacement tuition cost, about 2.7 in our insurance and pension cost. So although we're seeing some favorability this year, we are expecting a small increase next year in that category. And then, a slight increase in utilities, which we normally see, and then about $1 million in contractual salary increases. And I really put that in here this year because what we're anticipating is about a $4 million increase in cost related to contractual salary increases. So on the revenue side, we're expecting a small decline, and I say small, it's 7.3 million. And to give you some context, the budget this year was adopted at about $427 million in revenue. So we're expecting to adopt around that same number. We're expecting right now 427.2 million. but it is a small decline. On the state side, there's a magnet operating or magnet restructuring grant that we don't think will continue. And really on the federal side, there is a small decline in our entitlement grants, which we've seen over the year. And then we're just not expecting any additional carry forward as we go forward. Okay, so that's really it, economics and an outline of the process. In terms of our timeline, we're actually moving through the process, I think, fairly well here. So the schools right now have gone through, schools and departments, I said, they have all registered. So what usually happens, they have to go in and register with Allavue. They've been able to see and review their budgets. We sent out a reminder to them on Monday, to all the folks on Monday, if they have any changes, to please reach out to either their EDs, the school EDs, or their respective budget analysts to make sure we can make the changes for them. In the meantime, we've been going through and evaluating any strategic initiatives that align to the district priorities and starting to assemble those so we can start to cost and size those. And then maybe even more importantly, understand, what priority comes first and align those correctly according to where the needs are. And then next week, we'll spend a lot of time really just gathering all that information, pulling information from Allavue, making sure the analysis is done, making sure the funding's aligned in the right spots, and then starting to prepare for some information to share with the board. And I think that's what I just kind of talked through. Yep.
So I actually want to also add, Mr. Flagg, that, you talked about the prioritization, and some of that is happening at multiple levels. So it's certainly happening at the department levels, at the district office. It's also happening at the cabinet level, right? So myself and the remaining cabinet members, and it's happening. It's going to happen right at the school level with the school leaders and at the school sites. And I did engage principals today in a protocol because I really wanted to just gauge their thinking as well on two things. One, priorities, knowing that, there's still work that we had identified last year as important. Some of it was put on hold, and work that we're doing this year. And so those still are priorities for us. And so checking in as to what their thinking is about prioritizing those, and also getting some initial thinking. And hopefully there are some principals that will want to volunteer to help kind of vision out on the other recovery and acceleration ideas that we have, and ideas that are actually based on research and best practice, right? We know that in order to accelerate learning, we know that, for example, extended day and extended year is something that works. We also know that high dosage tutorial works, which is one of the reasons why we started with the current tutorial program that we have, just to see if there are, it's obviously much smaller in scale. We have, about 100 of our certified teachers, but just to see if there are any lessons learned there that we can, potentially scale. And, we also wanted to just get principals thinking around social and emotional supports that we can provide. And so all of that will help inform, right, the next few weeks, if you will, so that it can get us to the end of the budget development process, which is, Mr. Flagg, it's normally we end in May. So we're hoping to end in February. Is that the target?
Yeah, I think it'll be early February. Yeah, we'll be about 3 months ahead.
And we'll transition now into some questions, and I don't know if this is one of the questions, but potentially it will be. And there's still a lot of uncertainty, and so yes, right, I want to just acknowledge that. And so we are planning with what we know now. But there are some truths, right? There are things that we know are not going to change. We know that the research and our own data confirms that students that are remote learners, for example, or have some form of remote learning, can potentially experience up to a year and a half of learning loss. And that amount can be even greater for students that, that have higher needs, that are, reside in high need communities that tend to be, Black and Latino students. And so there are a lot of different things that we're trying to think through. Even despite the uncertainty that we have in front of us related to COVID, there are things that we know to be true and that we must and we will respond to. So I'm going to stop there, and I know that we are that there's a process for questions and answers, and so I'm going to turn it over to the team to help us with that.
Sure. So there are two questions regarding Alloview. So the first question is Alloview a new program HPS is using? If so, how much will that program cost? And then the second question is, who is training the district on Alloview?
Yeah, sure. I can take that. So Alloview actually has a training department. We just talked to them today about scheduling and trying to get some classes together for January when we all come back from break. So they'll end up conducting that training, and they're going to do it in two components. They'll come back through and make sure the folks that are comfortable with it now, they get them to, almost like an expert level. And then we'll go through and we'll do introductory training for all the folks who haven't seen it or just haven't had a chance to really spend any extensive time in it. So it'll really be two components there. And then, so it is a new software. So this is our first year getting involved in this. And I don't know the cost off the top of my head, but I can research that for you. I just don't know what the contract says.
It was an investment that was already made. And so we have purchased the program and the platform.
Okay, we don't have any additional questions at this time.
Mr. Flagg, is there anything else that you think you want to share? Or
No, I think you mentioned it. I mean, there's a lot of uncertainty here. I think this is where we stand right now. I think the process is working really well, and I just want to make sure the communication is open with all the folks that are involved in the process. And we just keep listening and thinking through this as we go through the next month or two.
yeah, there was actually one thing that I will share that I walked away with earlier today when we had the session with our school leaders, and it was just, the wondering that they had about how are we going to do all of this? How are we going to try to figure out how to tend to the priorities and find additional resources. And so that becomes a challenge, right? And that's where the prioritization comes in addition to the advocacy work that we know we're going to have to do. Certainly I'm going to have to do, and will engage, of course, our Board of Education as well to do as well, around the added funding, right, that we will need, given the impact that COVID is having and will continue to have. I always share that I've had conversations with colleagues, even back in the spring when we were first closed, and conversations were, my colleagues would say, oh, well, you know what, just let COVID happen so we can have a year to get back on our feet. And I remember, and I still do say that this is not a 1 year recovery, right? This is a multi-year recovery. And so it's, 3 to 5 years is the plan that is needed to address what is happening to all of our students, and for us to, support our students and recover the loss and the social and the emotional impact that is happening. So if there are no more questions that came in, just one more time before we log off.
We don't have any additional questions at this time, but I wanted to share out that future questions can be sent to outreach@hartfordschools.org, or persons can call the Welcome Center at 860-695-8400 to share their questions or comments.
Thank you for sharing the contact information. And again, thank you for everyone that joined us this evening. Please stay healthy and please stay safe. And thank you so much for your partnership.